Hello and good morning.
Hello. Good morning.
You're here. Congratulations. My name is Beth Bukowski, and I use she, they pronouns. I'm a white woman with glasses. I'm wearing a black turtleneck, dark plaid pants. You can't see them. I'm also wearing Darth Vader socks. And I have short brown hair. I'm an associate professor and director of the EDD and Leadership at Virginia Commonwealth University. With our return to Minneapolis and Minnesota, we have been able, as an association and as attendees, to deepen our understanding of the land on which we are meeting. Our conference is taking place on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Dakota Ayote, Dakota people, the original inhabitants and stewards of the land and waterways of Minneapolis, Minnesota. As we learn together, it is important that we connect and uplift the knowledge and community of the people of this land.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Yao, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an Asian American woman of Chinese descent with curly black hair, and I'm wearing a red blazer. I wish I was wearing my reading glasses so my middle-aged eyes can see the words, but we will make it through. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Carolina.
I have the honor of serving as chair of ASHE's Council for the Advancement of Higher Education Programs, or CAHEP. CAHEP is dedicated to advancing the field of higher education by fostering the development of academic programs and the scholars who lead them. Through professional development such as our pre-conference, workshops, and webinars, CAHEP supports ASHE members who serve as program coordinators. In CAHEP, we recognize that the future of higher education depends on our collective ability to nurture, educate, and inspire the next generation of scholars. I'd like to thank this year's CAHEP Executive Committee for their partnership in our work this year. We've hosted Academic Leaders Workshop, the Mid-Career Faculty Workshop, the Early Career Faculty Workshop, and over the past few months, we've hosted 3 webinars focused on supporting program coordinators. Thank you.
And this year, I am serving my second and final year as the chair of ASHE's Council for International Higher Education, or as we affectionately call it, CIHE. CIHE plays a pivotal role within ASHE by fostering a global perspective on the study of higher education. Our work centers on the exploration of international issues, trends, and challenges that impact higher education systems worldwide. Through our pre-conference, networking roundtables, International Scholars Workshop, and webinars, CIHE connects scholars and practitioners who are dedicated to understanding the global forces shaping higher education. And I'd like to thank this year's CIHE Executive Committee for their partnership in our work this year. From our pre-conference hosted earlier this week to our workshops and webinars to our newsletter, I appreciate this group's leadership as we continue to advance global dimensions of higher education within ASHE. Thank you. And as we transition to today's panel, we want to thank ECMC Foundation for their support of this event. ECMC Foundation is a national foundation whose North Star goal is to eliminate equity gaps in post-secondary completion by 2040. We are grateful to ECMC Foundation for their support in helping us to host this panel for us today.
Before I read the next part, I would just like to encourage everyone to text your friends because this panel is about to be amazing and they don't want to miss it, even though they don't know they don't want to miss it. So text your friends, they still have a few minutes to arrive. I am excited to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Dr. Tania D. Mitchell. Is a professor in the Department of Counseling, Higher Education, and Special Education at the University of Maryland, where she also serves as Associate Provost for Community Engagement. Tania is also co-chair, along with Tabitha Cruz, of the local Community Engagement Committee for the ASHE 2024 conference. Before her transition to Maryland this August, she was a faculty member for 12 years in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota. Her home in Minneapolis sits 3 blocks from the intersection of 38th and Chicago, where George Floyd was killed by the actions and inactions of Minneapolis police officers on May 25th, 2020. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for coordinating and moderating today's panel.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. Our plenary this morning picks up on a presidential session that was offered at the 2023 conference and moderated by one of last year's LCEC co-chairs, Dr. Jamaica Del Mar. Our intent this morning is to interrogate the Minnesota paradox and the structural forces at play that lead to the disparities we see in this state and others that impact people historically and currently marginalized. Our brilliant panel will also help us to understand the opportunities and changes necessary to confront and shift the dynamics of this paradox, especially the place of higher education institutions and research in doing so. The Minnesota paradox is coined by Professor Samuel Myers of the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota, and it refers to the contradiction between the state's overall high quality of life and strong social indicators and the stark racial disparities that exist within it. Minnesota is often ranked highly for education, healthcare, and economic opportunity, particularly for its white population. Just this year, the Institute for Quality of Life ranked the city of Minneapolis the happiest city in the United States. However, people of color and racially minoritized groups, especially Black, Indigenous, Latino, and refugee communities, experience some of the worst outcomes in the country in areas like education, income, housing, and incarceration. As just one example, measured by racial gaps in unemployment, income, incarceration, arrest, home ownership, mortgage lending rates, test scores, reported child maltreatment, school disciplinary and suspension, and even drowning rates. African Americans are worse off in Minnesota than they are in virtually every other state in the nation. This gap is especially striking given the state's progressive reputation and commitment to social welfare programs. Historical factors such as segregation, discriminatory housing procedures and policies like redlining, and unequal access to education have entrenched these disparities. Though the state promotes equity and inclusion, the benefits of its systems and policies have not been equitably distributed. The paradox highlights the need for intentional systemic change to close these gaps. And so today, our panelists are here to help us explore this phenomenon further. Dr. Kate Bean, who's sitting next to me, is a member of the Flanders Santee Sioux. Oh my gosh, I practiced. Flanders Santee Sioux Dakota and Muskogee Creek, and she is the executive director of the Minnesota Museum of American Art and serves as adjunct faculty in American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. In 2020, Dr. Bean was appointed by Governor Walz to serve on the Capital Area Architectural and Planning Board, which oversees capital complex preservation and development, including public art in downtown St. Paul. Previously, Kate served on the leadership team at the Minnesota Historical Society, where she was the director of Native American initiatives, engaging with both Native communities and tribes, and advocating for implementing Indigenous interpretation and involvement at historic sites throughout the state. Her family championed the restoration of the Dakota name, Bde-Makaska, in South Minneapolis. Next is Dr. Kirsten Delegard, who comes to us from the University of Minnesota Libraries, where, among other roles, she serves as the project director for the Mapping Prejudice Project. Her team's work interrogates structural racism behind the large racial disparities in home ownership, property values, wealth gaps, residential segregation, and housing insecurities in the Twin Cities. In the middle, we welcome Commissioner Irene Fernando. Irene is the first Filipino-American elected in Minnesota and is the youngest woman to serve on the Hennepin County Board. In January of 2023, she was elected as the first board chair of color since Hennepin County's founding in 1852. She is a strong advocate for those who are marginalized or structurally disenfranchised and has a wealth of knowledge on policies impacting the folks that live here. Sorry. Next is Councilmember Robin Wansley. She represents Ward 2 on the Minneapolis City Council, which includes the University of Minnesota.
Second ward.
She is the first Black independent democratic socialist to hold office in Minneapolis. Originally from Chicago, Wansley studied at Carleton College and completed a Watson Fellowship before moving to Minneapolis. Her community organizing and political work has focused on labor, racial justice, and restorative justice, public education, and environmental justice. And last but certainly not least is Lipao Zhang. He is the founding director of the Center for Hmong and East Asian Studies and professor of American Government, Political Science and Hmong Studies at Concordia University in St. Paul. In 2000, President Clinton appointed Lipao to serve on the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, making him the first Hmong presidential appointee in the nation. He is the founder of the Asian Economic Development Association and has won numerous awards for his services to the community over the years. Please join me in welcoming our panel. So to begin, and by way of introduction, can you each briefly touch on how you see the Minnesota paradox at play in the lives of people in the communities to which you belong, serve, support, or engage here in the Twin Cities? Start with you.
I think it's hard to pick one thing. When I think about this paradox, when I think about what Minnesota nice is, for me, Minnesota nice is Minnesota complacency. And Minnesota nice is not being so vocal with your racism and implicit bias and impact and continuing to exclude people who have been historically marginalized and left out and erased. And it impacts absolutely every single element of our lives, whether it's purchasing a home or renting or taking out a student loan or having a baby or getting a job. And it's literally there every step of the way. And it's something that we consistently have to be cognizant of and consistently have to battle, though people don't like to think of it as a battle. It's what it feels like.
So, Minnesota nice. I've been thinking about this, especially in the last couple days, and I feel like I've been returning to this idea that Minnesota nice is about an unwillingness to see. You know, so you went through this long litany of statistics, right? The information is clear, the facts are indisputable, but I would say there was a breakthrough in 2020. But one of the through lines here is an unwillingness to see those disparities, to constantly be wrapping them up into these very persistent myths about this place. And so that's why my colleagues and I, we started Mapping Prejudice, is to we mobilize community members to map racial covenants in community sessions and make a digital map, because we wanted to experiment with new ways of getting people who are not directly affected by structural racism to see structures. So.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hennepin County Commissioner Irene Fernando, but you can call me Commish. I use she, her pronouns, and it really is an honor to get to be here today. As shared, I'm the youngest woman to ever serve on the county board, the first Filipino American elected in the state of Minnesota, and I'm the first board chair of color in our 172-year history. And so, in Minnesota, counties have a unique role around what might be considered social programs or caring for the vulnerable. And so through these lenses, the Minnesota paradox, as it's often referred to, is primarily along racial lines. So white families and individuals being much better off systemically, regardless of how they began in this state, compared to, very, very broadly, communities of color. Now, it is because, in my opinion, it is because of these broad swaths and the lack of nuance that we're unable to kind of get deeper than that. Economics is a huge through line here. With the extraction of resources by stolen land and the extraction of talent, of labor, through indentured servitude here and enslavement, the paradox is not really that perplexing. in many ways. It's just really difficult to talk about. So along racial lines, no contest. There's almost no way out. And intersecting with that is class, is money, is economics, who can shift their economic condition. And so the summary answer on how I seek to navigate these very, very complex and nuanced and multifaceted concepts that we're discussing here is how a person or entity or institution chooses to acknowledge and close the gap. It was actually in the intro. Social welfare programs will not solve an institutional gap that has been perpetuated so that certain communities here still can be better off than others. So we need institutional resolution to these gaps and not individual resolution to these gaps is one way that I would think about the question.
Yeah, so my fellow panelists have already touched on a couple of things, and what I will just thread what I've heard thus far is the complacency points and basically link that with a lack of political will. And what I often see in my position on a municipal level, where I sit next to my fellow elected leaders who will, all day, every day, go in front of working class people and residents and say, I support racial justice, I support economic justice, I support livable wages. And then as a policymaker, I say, oh, bet, okay, cool. How about $15 minimum wage for Uber and Lyft drivers? And they say, oh, wait, hold on. So how did you come up with that figure? Do we do 15 like right now? Could we phase that in like 5 years? And that's literally what happened earlier this year. I brought a $15 minimum wage proposal for Uber and Lyft drivers who have been underpaid for many, many years by two multi-billion-dollar organizations. And our mayor and our governor, who just finished their bid for a VP, effort for this country, fought tooth and nail against paying our own working class rideshare drivers a bare minimum of $30,000 a year. So that is the contradiction that we're constantly up against, where we're saying, one thing, okay, we know the challenges, we know what is needed, like we know the disparities, is when we finally bring the proposals that can rectify it, where we often see the elected leaders who have the ability to shift the power, to shift resources, to shift investments, they don't want to exhibit or exhort or demonstrate the will or act on it. And I think that's part of the Minnesota kind of conundrum of why. And I would say the why as a socialist is Minnesota is also home to the largest concentration of Fortune 500 companies. We're a very, very wealthy state. And what I've seen in my journey of doing policy work and being pretty effective in that work and having a lot of fights with a lot of developers and a lot of corporations is most of our elected officials really give precedence and preferential treatment to what our Chamber of Commerce are saying, what large corporations are saying. As soon as a Fortune 500 company said we're about to bounce, all bets are off. And we see that every single time when our nurses in a post-COVID reality, again, we're talking about healthcare disparities. You can't rectify healthcare disparities without the workers who are providing the essential services. And they're saying they're struggling under the conditions of our exploitative healthcare system, and they need additional resources. Here's a bill that can help us. And our clinic, Mayo Clinic, one of the largest clinics in this state, said, yeah, we're not here for that. We don't like that. And if you support that, legislator and governor, we're removing all of our investments in this state and we're bouncing. And the governor vetoed that. So that is the dynamic of and we're talking about almost 70-something thousand nurses who would have seen immediate improvements in their conditions that would have had positive ripple effects for their clients, for the overall healthcare industry in our state, and ultimately improve healthcare outcomes for our residents. That immediately tanked because of a healthcare organization, a for-profit healthcare organization said, no, that's going to hurt our bottom line, and we don't want to do that. So I constantly see the paradox of we will not take on these disparities if it hurts the bottom line of a for-profit entity, and we care more about that than you Black, you brown, you indigenous, you trans, whoever. And that's always the fight that we're going to have to be up against.
Good morning. My name is Lee Pao Xiong. I think being Asian in Minnesota, it's very difficult because we're always being showcased as the model minority. And because of being the model minority, income is quite high, education is quite high, so on and so forth. But here in Minnesota, we have a really interesting population, 103,000 Hmong, the largest concentration of Hmong population in the United States. And when you disaggregate the data, you will see that we have disparities in health, disparity in education, in income. So for example, the pandemic, we have over 200 people die from COVID. More than half of those are Hmong people. And so to be left out of the statistics, I would say, requires us to think strategically to say, how do we get ourselves into these policy positions? And this, 2025 will mark the 50th anniversary of the Southeast Asian in Minnesota, or Hmong in Minnesota. And I'm happy to say that we have 9 Hmong legislators at the Capitol. Now we have county commissioners, we have city council members, and they're able to elevate some of these issues forward. And for the first time, we've had bills that directly benefited our community. We've had legislators that basically said, wait a minute, here are some issues that we need to deal with. And so it takes a while. It shouldn't take 50 years. And so we're trying to really, even pushing for the superintendent of the St. Paul Public School, where 30% of the student population are Hmong. And we're saying, of all the 103,000 Hmong in the state of Minnesota, you can't find one person that qualifies to be a superintendent of a district. I would say it's up to you. It's because of you. You failed to develop leaders within your institutions to get to be in this position, because you never focused on us. And so things like that, I think the paradox is really interesting when you think about the terminology, but it takes us a while to get to have representation. Representation does matter in all levels of government, in all levels of institutions, even being in academia, to have scholars to write about these things, scholars to bring these issues up. So that's how I see it.
I heard a number of kind of underlying issues: the lack of representation, complacency, a refusal to see, right? A lack of political will as sort of undergirding this Minnesota paradox. But what do you think is at the root of the inability to remedy some of the disparities that we see here in Minnesota? Anyone can feel welcome.
I would say fear.
Say more.
Well, so when my family did the work to advocate for the restoration of B'nai Makaska and our Dakota name and our Dakota homeland, I come from a community of people that were literally removed under military guard. My grandparents were imprisoned in a concentration camp that the state of Minnesota doesn't want to call a concentration camp. They want to call it an internment camp because there's a question over whether we were there for our own protection when our women were being used for target practice by the military. So we live in this place where our neighbors and this society don't understand who we are, even though they tried to assimilate us. They tried to erase us, so they don't understand us. They don't know who we are, they don't know where we live. There's a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge, and there's also a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion. And a lack of understanding the world through other people's perspectives and other people's lived experiences, and understanding that impact. Kim Tallbear, a wonderful professor, told me when we were doing the B'nai Makaska work, and I was talking about the kind of backlash we were receiving and the kind of hate mail my family was getting and the results of doing that work. And she said, they're afraid we're going to do to them what they did to us. we don't do things that way. We're not like that. When you come from a community that's been historically marginalized, that's been historically left out, when you know how it feels to be forgotten, and not just forgotten, but intentionally erased from a place both physically, emotionally, socially, every single way, you don't wish that on anybody else. You just want to be heard, and you want to be seen, and you want your children to know that they belong.
Going down, or are we?
Whoever's ready.
Oh, okay. So what's at the root of our inability to close these gaps? Well, gaps is a very generous term, and something that I've been reflecting a lot on is not seeing anything as passive. So we're not lacking anything. What is present that is making this outcome be so? And attempting to reflect on that, and I've applied that to the word root. So root, the base of something, the initiator, the cause. For those who are interested in plants, roots aren't how it starts. It starts with seeds, or if your plant falls off, you can root a plant by placing it in water. And so I've been trying to reflect on a root system as not a noun or as a causal piece, but what is the system that creates the foundation for something? And in plants, roots are how one receives nourishment. So what is the foundation that exists and the dynamic ongoing nourishment that exists in order for this inability to close the gaps? Well, quite frankly, most people in power and in decision making don't want the gaps to close. That's really, it's amazingly simple in that way. Some donors somewhere, they're not my donors, some donors somewhere, probably not yours, are just really, really, really powerful. And the ones that are closest to my heart right now are anti-trans or anti-intersex laws. And when we look at that specific area, the corporate interests, really the corporate healthcare interests that are spending literally billions, like with a B, like bigger than Beyonce money B, like to fight these bills in small legislatures. I mean, that's really, so yeah, the short answer is the decision makers and or those who fund the decision makers do not want these gaps to close. We gotta really confront that. And then secondly, I invite, pushback too, I'm trying to use more activated language. Because every single outcome that we have was chosen by someone, was carefully crafted, was invested upon, strategized. People literally died in order for the conditions we have now to persist. And I don't know, that's obviously kind of like a heartbreaking way of thinking about it. And so, mix that in with individual and community practices that ensure that you experience and promote your individual personhood in these rooms. This really is, it is extracting, soul crushing work. And I do believe, for me, that is where I'm reflecting on that question this morning.
I think it's lack of political wills, right? And also lack of representation. I remember after the LA riot, I had the opportunity to go down to LA. And in meeting with many of the leaders within the Rebuild LA movement, one of the things that they said was, we had to really look inward, and we realized that we're the majority, but the majority of the people, or all of the people on the city council, are actually whites. And majority of the people in these districts are actually people of color. And that's when we realized, you know what, we got to change that dynamic. Why don't we run for office? Why don't we seek for office? Be the city council member, be on the board, and to change the dynamic. And things did change a little bit, And I think that's something that we learned as a new American community to say, in order to get our voices heard, in order to be able to allocate resources to address issues within our community, we got to be sitting at the table, right? This is the first time ever, after 50 years, we came from a war-torn country, that we're able to allocate and secure money from the state legislature to address PTSD issues within our community, right? It shouldn't take 50 years. Many of the American GIs who came back receive all these services. And so I think, having the political will, have the political leverage, right? We have people from our community serving as chairs of committees, important committees. They say, if you don't fund this, I'm not going to vote for this, And so it's got to get, we have to get to that point, right, in order to really change. And until we take ownership, I think, of our own future, then we're not going to be able to change anything. I used to serve on the board of a large foundation in the Twin Cities here. And I remember one of the president basically said, well, we just funded a Hmong organization, so we should fund the other one. And I'm like, majority of the organizations you funded are all white organizations. Why don't you put on the same criteria? And we only have 2 or 3 Hmong organizations, and yet you said, and so because of that, a colleague of mine who's Hispanic, and we basically resigned from the board. We said, you don't want us here. You just want to rubber stamp your board. We don't need to be here. So we left the board together. And I think it takes, to that point to change anything. And if you don't see that as something that's relevant, even during the elections, people don't feel like they want to go to vote. And say, what matters? Why would it matter? It does really matter. Voting participation, political participation does really matter. So I think until we are in the system, we won't be able to change the system from the inside out. And I always say that if I can't change the system from outside, I'll infiltrate the system and change it from the inside.
So,
Go ahead, Brad.
it's my, okay. I do want to just put a caution on that piece, because I do think that adds to the paradox that we're seeing. And this is actually a dynamic that we see nationally, and I would say this is a detriment to liberalism. In Minnesota, we are really good at parading Black and brown people who aren't super complicit in aiding the state and carrying out really horrible policies and practices that hurts our people. I sit alongside Black folks. Right now, we're debating, especially in this conversation, the future of George Floyd Square. And there's literally a proposal that the city is trying to force through, and our current mayor, again, the very city that not only is responsible for the death of George Floyd, and was willing to try to cover it up had it not been for a young Black woman filming it and basically a police precinct burning and the whole city basically erupting in an uprising over it, is now dictating what is going to happen at that site. And the community is literally pushing back. But nevertheless, the city is trying to force a whole proposal to essentially erase and dictate the narrative of that site, because it's a reminder of their failure. And they don't like that, because we don't like to really acknowledge the ways in which we continually perpetuate racist, messed up things in our city. So again, vote just happened yesterday. And we have a elected leader who is Black trans woman who represents that area, who is pushing for the city's proposal. And they are known to typically press for the city's proposals that often contradicts the needs of their residents, their own direct residents, be it also other trans people, other unhoused folks. And so I often have to caution that piece too, and it's kind of the slogan of like, all your skin folks ain't your kin folks. And I see that time and time again, particularly in the current mayoral administration that I serve in. This particular mayor is really good at placing Black and brown, indigenous and queer shields in their administration to go out and do their bidding and take political hits and then discard them when they're ready to be done with them. So I will caution against that, or the limitations, especially of identity politics, because liberalism does that as a way to not actually do transformative work. In a way, it becomes a symbolic DEI measure of like, I'm not going, it's like the Nancy Pelosi when she did the kneeling with the kente cloth. No, boo, no, we want reparations. I don't need you in a photo in a kente cloth scarf. Like the proposals were very clear, and time again, we're given symbolic gestures when we actually need investments. We need policy changes. And so they're like, I'll give you a token, elected position. I'll give you, again, one seat at the table, and it's going to be a highly regulated seat. I'm going to make sure you might not have voting, authority. So I also want to make sure, like, we caution against that, because that's also what has created a lot of the messery that we're dealing with here in Minneapolis, because they constantly weaponizes Black and brown, our identities, our marginalized identities, to also keep disparities in place.
So I'll just name, I'm the only white woman up here. And from where I sit too, I think one of the roots of the problem is the sense that people don't understand that our liberations are all tied up in one another. It's this, you're talking about fear, you're talking about tokenism. I mean, that is all, that's all an outcome of this idea that, I do the work that I do because I believe that the future of my children is dependent on our ability to heal and to close these gaps. That this is not something for someone else. This is about me. And I'm struggling right now in this moment, especially, and we're going to talk about this more, as an educator, as a person, as a human, as a resident of this place. How do we get people to invest more in this idea that we are all bound together?
And I want to also add that we get caught up in this. I think we talked earlier this morning about deficit mentality.
Yeah, right.
That there's limited amount of resources, and for me, it's like we have plenty of resources. It's a prioritization of those resources. Yeah. And so I remember being at the Capitol and say, we don't have money for your initiative, but by golly, you got $2 million, and I'm only asking for a little chunk of change. And you got $2 million to build a fishing museum in the middle of nowhere. So there, it's a matter of priority. So my priority is, addressing social economic issues within my community. Yeah. But you said you don't have money, but you have money to build a fishing museum in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's going to get there. So that's where I think, again, being careful not to fall into that trap of to say we have limited resources, we don't have money. Yes, you do. You have money. It's a matter of prioritization, and it usually rests with the governor and the chair of the committees because they always make the decision on what to allocate things for. And so if we're not part of that process, we won't be able to have those meaningful conversations and those negotiations that's necessary.
Just to extend on that, I think it's good to not fall for the scarcity, but even in that example, that's not the contrast that I would raise. It's not among social determinants of health and whatever in outstate Minnesota. It's people who couldn't spend all of their money in 10 lifetimes.
Yeah.
And then the rest of us. I mean, truly. And so even in that really good reminder, like, we really have to be focused on who the contrasting parties are, I don't know. Again, I don't know if it's the 1% of the 1%, or I don't know who, but do you hear what I'm getting at? Like, and think of wages, $15. My goodness, it should literally be $26 an hour.
Baby.
Just mathematically. Just mathematically.
Baby.
That is the minimum, is what it should be according to literally every study. And then yet, we are in a society where people are making $200 million as their annual salary? Question mark? Like, it doesn't, so when we talk about scarcity, even, really as an exercise, I understand that this might not be how you open your meetings, but as an exercise, really being interrogating who you're contrasting that to.
Thank you. We had like 87,000 questions prepared for today, and we are not going to get to many of them. So with the last minutes that we have, I'm going to switch to our current moment.
Yeah.
So given the recent results of this election, what is the work? Look at the groan, the collective groan. Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
What is the work that you are readying yourself for under the new wackadoo administration? And in particular, what do you hope we focus on as leaders and scholars of higher education in light of these results?
If I can say, I think for me, thinking about this question, it's a very complicated question, but it goes back to, I was raised by a family that were community organizers and activists. And my entire professional career, which includes getting a doctorate degree as a high school dropout, to becoming the first to serve on the leadership team at the State Historical Society, to being the first to serve as a native executive director of an American art museum in this country, is really thinking about the fact that we belong, and the fact that being labeled an activist isn't a bad thing. It's being who we are, and having other people understand that that fight, that push, is literally why we are still here. We've had to do it since before we were born. We've had to be on guard, be defensive, look out for ourselves and past generations and future generations ever since we came into being. That's the impact of colonialism. And understanding the contemporary impact of colonialism is really important, understanding it and being honest about it. I don't know how to be anything other than honest, because as a Dakota person, that's the values that I was raised with. And I stick to that, and I hold strong to it, which means when things aren't right, I don't stand for it. And to have to bow down to these different notions of trying to figure out, I mean, this whole inside versus outside the system thing, we need all of it.
Yes.
We have to be everywhere.
That's correct.
And that's not asking for too much. And the fact is, we just have to do it, and we will do it. And we have to double down on our efforts. Individual donors, I'm in the art world. It is a crazy place to go from the history world to the art world, and the amount of money. I walk into people's homes that I have just seen in magazines. I see views of the river that my family will never see. That's our land, that's our river. And there's a sense of ownership to it. And I have to fight back and make people see that it's not theirs, that it's all of ours. And that when we indigenize a space, it's not just about us as people. Indigenizing is listening to the land, is listening to the universe, is thinking about things outside of ourselves as people, and putting that into practice. And so being honest, holding others accountable, getting donors to double down, whether it's foundation, individual donors, corporate giving, they need to step up, they need to switch what they've been doing behind those closed doors. It needs to change.
Well, building on that, so I was called the work that I do that I'm a truth teller, and that in the years to come, it's I mean, it's always been important, to your point, and it's going to get a lot more important, and it's going to get a lot harder. So before I started mapping prejudice, I spent the first half of my career actually studying McCarthyism and just the earlier iterations of Red Scares and blacklisting. And you know, the past has never passed, right? We're in scoundrel time again, and we're really going to have to be very, very honest about what's coming for us. And you don't have to look to the McCarthyism, you don't have to look to the 60s. You can just look back to the last Trump administration. So I'll just use this example. At the end of the last Trump administration, an executive order came down saying that any federal agency, the first executive order was any federal agency was not allowed to hear any trainings that mentioned structural, I'm gonna find the quote, structural racism, divisive anti-American propaganda, or anything that sends the message that virtually all white people contribute to racism. That was the executive. And so based on that executive order, all my presentations in the fall of 2020 were canceled because the order was actually expanded to include any organization that received federal funding, in other words, everyone. So I am expecting on approximately January 20th for another such order to come down. And I am gonna keep talking. And so I'm gonna have to find new venues, and we are all gonna have to be contributing, we're all gonna have to be circling up, and we're all gonna have to be in solidarity and be realistic that this is what's happening, and we have to be prepared to support one another and just keep doing the work.
I fully expect, again, cities to be on the front lines of defense and just naming, what Kristen just highlighted in terms of how are we going to step up in the gaps to defend, like not only just like civil liberties, but like funding also. If federal governments are threatening to cut funding, if we are still planning to continue on advocating for like our progressive policies and continuing those things, we should be willing to step up to fund those things in case those funding measures are eliminated or cut or whatever the case may be. So I fully expect a lot of collaboration to come between our county and state partners on how we're going to do that work together. I know my first measure in the fall, me and my colleagues are passing a civil rights ordinance to add additional protected classes so that we are starting to like get in preparation for that. So I fully expect, again, frontline defense, and we're going to have to be adaptable in many ways because so much of this is unknown, and I get the desire to want to bunker prep, but it's just like we're going to have to be resilient. And as a Black person working with Indigenous folks, like we've lived through apocalyptic conditions, so we'll figure it out. But what I want to at least leave a message for folks in higher ed, especially someone who has a university in my ward who works closely with students, I think what is most important in this moment where people are looking for places of hope and places for sites of struggle against this administration. And historically, higher ed has been that. And right now it's not looking like that. It has been honestly a place of repression from administration. And I know many educators are experiencing that, and many of our students are experiencing that, and largely in response to the genocide happening in Gaza. And I just need to name that. And I'm even dealing with that right now where I've had over dozens of students who I'm bringing a resolution in support of who were just recently arrested for doing a divestment protest. And there's a likelihood that our own city attorney will be pressing charges against them. And I'm having to advocate to say no. So our students who pay tuition that are, helping sustain our universities do not feel like these are places of belonging for them. And they are looking to their educators to support them in this space. And also these are our future leaders. Many of the policies that I'm working on, that many of my colleagues are working, we get our pipeline of talent from universities. So it is so important that we also wrap our arms around our university students right now, as they are doing the work of contesting what we're talking about on this stage, like the disparities, be it both in our backyards or in places like Gaza or in Sudan, like contesting war conditions and genocidal conditions. And I think it's important as educators, we stand up, and that it's not feeling like that solidarity in this moment right now.
I wanted to add that the first time somebody called me a fucking chink and told me to go home was in 1979 when we moved to Minnesota. The last time I was called that was during President Trump's last term, right? And so we're waiting for the racism that will come down the pipeline. And so when you talk about protests and so on and so forth, Project 2025, you know that word, right? And talking about denaturalizations. If you are a United States citizen through denaturalization process, if you commit a felony, you have a felony conviction, you're subject for deportation. And you're stripped of your citizenship, right? So these are things that I think that, again, those students who are protesting, against certain policies within the federal government, if they get arrested, good luck, they're gonna be sending back. We have 500 Hmong individuals throughout the United States that will be deported back because they're not citizens. They came here as young people and made the wrong choice and committed a crime. They're in detention. They're waiting for deportation to the country of Laos, a country that they knew nothing about. And so these are things that we're hearing from the community already, and it gets my blood boiling when I go to them. I said, but you voted for the freaking guy, not to be politically partisan, but you voted. Do you understand what you were voting for? And so these are things that we have to constantly deal with, from academia, where we're trying to get the facts out to people, but they're not listening. But then we end up, as scholars, trying to solve the problem for them as well. So those are things that it's on my mind. It's a conversation that we've had in the community. People are fearful, and we shouldn't have to live in a fearful society. We escaped communism to come here, and here we are acting like a communist country. So that's something that's on the mind of elders, on the mind of the community, and certainly on my mind.
I'll just add really quick. I think also just making sure that people who are teaching know that they have that freedom to teach and to share their truth. I think that's something that often gets worried about, that we see an impact at in terms of silencing people who need to speak their truth and to speak about these things with their students, to be honest about the retaliation and the impact of that. We know that racism exists. We're not surprised by it ever, and we also know how to respond.
I would really encourage a lot of interrogation from just the question, the results of the presidential election. Very interestingly, I served under the president-elect previously in terms of my governing was under that presidency. And amazingly, a lot of the people who vote for me also vote for this individual. And so I have about 50% residents in the city and 50% in the suburbs, and it is a mix. And so that's really invited and demanded for me a further interrogation about my assessment as to what's going on. So I know that we're at time. So first, in my opinion, we must hold institutions far more accountable than individuals. The institutions are who decides how they speak to the residents, to the potential voters. And so for those of us who are firmly against genocide anywhere, we were not spoken to in the political discourse for this past election, and that needs to be confronted. The second thing that I would say, to answer your question more directly, is to attempt to take very seriously what this administration has promised. And so protecting immigrants, refugees, those with a wide range of papers or documentation must be at the center of any institution, and certainly for local governments like us. We are, in many ways, the last line of defense, and I share Councilmember Wansley's words with that. The last thing, I'll answer the question directly. What's the most recent thing that we have been bringing, or I've brought forward to attempt to counteract what's occurring, is to recodify gender-affirming care. Hennepin County is a safe place, and we made sure that every single word was commaed and separated. I'm aware that at different times in the history of LGBTQIA plus histories that individuals have been left out. And so how may we be more precise? I invite further precision, because when we dismiss the loss, whatever you want to call the loss being, to something that was an exception to the rule, something that was surprising, then we are missing the responsibilities we hold in the places where we have leadership.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your insights and contributions to this conversation. It was really powerful. What is sticking with me right now is Commissioner Fernando's piece around the outcomes that we experienced were designed and strategized. And Dr. Bean's reminder that the fight is why we're still here. And Councilmember Wansley's reminder that higher education should be a space of hope and belonging. I'm really honored to have had this opportunity to share the stage with you and grateful for your presence here today. Thank you also for those of you in the audience who made time to be here with us and being part of this experience. And finally, thanks again to the ECMC Foundation for their support. Thank you.
Thank you to this incredible panel for helping us to not only understand the nuances of the city we're meeting in again this week, but also helping us to expand our thinking about our own communities back home and how we as scholars can better connect our work to our communities. So please give them another round of applause. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Le. I use he, him pronouns. And I am an Asian American man of Vietnamese descent with glasses and long hair in a bun, wearing a burgundy mock neck with a navy suit, and I am a third-year PhD student at UCLA. I currently serve as chair of ASHE Graduate Student Committee, or GSC. In 2022, the ASHE Graduate Student Committee was formed to expand opportunities for involvement for graduate students within the association. This was a stated goal in the ASHE 2020-2023 ASHE Strategic Plan. Over the past few years, the GSC has hosted virtual writing groups, conference sessions specifically for graduate students, as well as a graduate student luncheon during the conference. I'd like to thank the 2024-2025 members of the Graduate Student Committee. I am grateful to these members who are helping to deepen graduate student engagement within ASHE.
Good morning, my name is Vigor Lam. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the Higher Education Leadership Program at Colorado State University and based in San Francisco, California, the traditional homelands of the Ramaytush and Ohlone peoples. I'm an Asian American man of Cantonese Chinese descent with short black hair, studded earrings, a patchy facial beard and mustache, and wearing a black polo under a gray patterned blazer and dark Levi jeans. I currently serve as one of the 2 elected graduate student members of the ASHE Board of Directors. I bring greetings from my fellow grad rep, Hannah Hin White, who had to leave the conference earlier this morning. I'd also like to recognize April Horn, who is the incoming graduate student rep on the board. Graduate students make up about 40% of ASHE's membership, and about 40% of attendees this week are graduate students. ASHE has a long history of working to support graduate students, and I'm grateful to the ASHE board for continuing this work over the past year. There are several opportunities, not only with the Graduate Student Committee or the board of directors, but also with ASHE's 25 committees and each of our councils. There are opportunities for professional development and mentoring, such as CPPHE's Graduate Student Policy Seminar, CEP's Mentor Project Program, which I have also been part of, and CIHE's Networking Roundtables and International Scholars Workshop. Since 2008, ASHE's members have generously donated to the Graduate Student Travel Fund and provided nearly $100,000 in travel scholarships to graduate students. I am grateful to have been one of these travel scholarship recipients. And this year, ASHE past president, Dr. Kristen Wren, and her wife, Dr. Melissa McDaniels, provided a donation to establish ASHE's first ever dissertation research grant.
And to my fellow ASHE grads, I encourage you to get involved in the association as you are able to. There are opportunities with long-term commitments, such as serving on the board, but also opportunities with shorter commitments, such as serving as a session chair, which many of us have done this week.
And to our colleagues who are once graduate students, whose journey into academia started as a graduate student at an ASHE conference, thank you for your service in serving on panels, professional development events, for advocating for full engagement of graduate students within ASHE, and for your generosity in financially supporting us through your donations.
We hope you enjoy the remainder of the conference, and thank you and have a wonderful day.